Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. Today, we're going to be talking about the challenges of serving as board chair of a small cap public company. And joining me to have this discussion is Sharon Gabrielson, who's the chairman of the board of the Sharps Compliance Corporation, a small cap company. She also sits on the board of a private company, Ethos Veterinary Health. So Sharon, welcome to the show.
Thank you, TK. It's great to be here this morning.
So this is particularly important to me because we always seem to be shooting high and letting information sort of trickle down. But as you know, a majority, probably 75% of the companies that are public companies are below the $2 billion in sales, which sort of fits them into either a small cap or possibly even what they call a micro cap. But the challenges of a small cap or a micro cap are very different than what we typically talk about relative to a large cap or a Fortune 500. So it's only appropriate that we sort of take a little time to talk about, the challenges of a small cap or the challenges of being the leader of the board in a small cap. So where I'd like to start is, I wonder if you could just talk about what board members should either know or be reminded of if they already know it, with respect to the challenges of serving on a small cap public company.
TK, I think you bring up a couple of really good points in that, as you mentioned, more than 74% of all publicly traded companies in the US today are small cap companies. What board members need to keep in mind as they're considering a small cap board or are on a small cap board is, number one, the CEO doesn't often have experience running a public company. So how do you as a board provide that mentoring, that education? Sometimes you have to look at connecting them with external resources in order to be able to help them. The second component is that you often have a very thin and lean executive leadership team. Likely, you don't have general counsel, for example, on board. You don't have internal investor relations. Your CFO may not be someone who's familiar with running a publicly traded board when they come into the position. So, understanding that many of the leadership team may not have that experience, but also that they are, as we say, a mile wide and an inch deep, and they're wearing multiple hats. They're stretched very thin. Your resources are often very limited. And with all you're being asked to do, disclosures, SEC filings, engagements, all these are pressures that the board needs to understand, keep attuned to, and be aware of in order to be able to support the executive team as they move forward.
So I'll add something to that too, because when you talked about senior management, well, the board as well probably isn't as experienced because if a new board member is going to take a first-time assignment, the chances are pretty high that it's going to be a smaller board for them to sort of get their feet wet. And that presents an additional challenge, particularly for the chair, who's sort of trying to put together this effective board, which is a great segue into the next two-part question that I want to ask you, Sharon. So knowing that you're sitting in this important seat, number one, how do you, as the chairman of the board, go about creating the most effective culture and governance structure, knowing what you just discussed of the challenges and the lack of resources? And part two of this would be, how do you, as the chairman, go about developing that all-important relationship with the CEO to ensure that you have the best chance of being a successful company? So it's a very challenging two-part question.
So let me start with the answer to the first part of your question. As chairman of the board of a small cap company, there are several components that you need to keep in mind. The first is clear delineation of roles and responsibilities. To your point, TK, many of these individuals that come onto small cap boards, this is their first publicly traded board. It may even be their first for-profit board. And so understanding the role of the board and governance, that the board is there to govern and that the CEO is responsible for the operations and the management of the company is very important. Any member of the board needs to be onboarded. And oftentimes small companies have a very hard time with onboarding experience. They may be able to orient the new board member to the business and to the customer base and the business model. But when it comes to understanding the publicly traded components around SEC regulations, around what material disclosures are, all of those things are challenging for small cap boards to be able to orient their management or their boards to. So resources like Small Cap Institute, for example, that have a wealth of information and libraries on what it means to be a small cap director, as well as a small cap CEO and a CEFO, are extremely important. The second principle that I would say is very important is that any member of the board needs to then be able to contribute at the board meetings, to feel comfortable asking specific questions, challenging questions, but that any member of the board or management team that is sitting at the table during the board meeting need to be able to call a timeout, raise their hand if the board starts to dive into operational issues. It's really hard for many board members who have been operators and CEOs and CAOs of their companies to come to the board table for the first time and wear a governance hat versus an operating hat. So it's very important that the board feels confident and comfortable checking each other. Open, transparent dialogue, respectfully challenging, those are key to ensuring that the board is a high-performing board. And then ensuring that the board has the right skill sets to support the CEO and their team. So for example, having a board skills matrix and experience matrix, where annually the board is looking at those skills and abilities that are needed at the board table in order to best support the management team in achieving the strategic and operating plan. For example, the board I sit on, and I chair, we review that annually. And anytime we have an open board seat, we're very specific about the skills and abilities that are needed where there's a gap, and focusing on recruitment from that perspective for our board members. Again, education on small cap issues. So we have quarterly, we talk about education that's needed from a board perspective in order to keep us aware of the top of mind issues. Investor relations are different. So we bring our investor relations folks in. ESG is important, but at a very different level in a small cap company. And so understanding how we not only educate ourselves around ESG and how it applies to us as a small cap company, but then how we educate the investors and the street in those differences as well. So the second part of your question, how do you go about developing that all important relationship between the CEO and the board chair in order to ensure the best chance of being and leading a successful company? This is a great question. I recently posted a LinkedIn article under this title on my LinkedIn page. One of the most critical elements of a successful organization is the relationship between the board chair and the CEO. And trust and mutual respect are fundamental tenets of that relationship. These pillars require frank an open and transparent conversation and communication, meeting on a regular basis. So the CEO of Sharps Compliance and I have a standing meeting every week. If we don't have a lot to talk about, we give each other back that 15 minutes, but we're constantly checking in to keep each other abreast of the things that we are working on, of the information has come to light within the last week, both from the governance and board perspective, as well as the operations perspective. Having that clear relationship between the CEO running the business and being responsible for day-to-day operations and executing the strategic plan, and the chair supporting that and running the governance and the board are really important tenets to that relationship. Also, a mentoring relationship, particularly from a small cap public board perspective. Again, as we talked about earlier, many of these CEOs do not have public company experience running a public company. And so as a board chair and an operator, a previous operator, it's my responsibility to bring that knowledge and experience to the CEO as a mentor and to help him in navigating that challenge, as well as interacting with the board.
These are all great points, Sharon. And I will add two things. Number one, it's very important that much like the CEO being the right CEO, that the chair of the board has the right skill set to do all the things that you just described. So certainly from my position, with all the experience that you've had serving on boards, Sharps Compliance is fortunate to have somebody with your experience to sort of deal this out. And the other thing from your comments that reminds me of important piece of advice to pass along, and that's to new board members. One of the only complaints and one of the reasons that boards are trying to find people that have previous board experience is that their biggest complaint is that new directors sometimes commandeer board meetings by asking questions about things that they should know coming into the meeting. For example, the basics of reading financial statements, or how the basics of governance work, so that they aren't sort of taking a lot of time. And that's an obligation that a new director, I believe, has, is to make sure that you are equipped with the foundational issues to be a director, so that the questions that you're asking are good, probing questions on the discussion and not questions to educate yourself on things that you should already know.
Those are great points, DK. Those are great points.
So, Sharon, again, I am so happy that we are able to sort of target to a small cap group. I appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us. And I'll look forward to maybe having you back again when we want to sort of dip our toe into the small cap arena, since I know you're so active with the Small Cap Institute as well. So thanks for taking the time and joining us today.
Thank you, TK, for shedding light on this important topic and the difference between small cap companies and large cap.
Yeah, my pleasure. And that will conclude this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.